20 years had passed since the Great Exodus and the galaxy was unrecognizable. Former Council President Lim Hai-jin walked through the ruins of the galactic capital remembering the glory days when thousands of species had worked together in what they had believed was perfect harmony. The great towers that had once reached toward the stars were now crumbling monuments to failed dreams. The transport systems that had moved millions of people efficiently through the city were rusted hulks that no one remembered how to repair. The energy grid that had powered a civilization was dark and silent. Lim Hai-jin remembered the day the humans had announced their departure. She had been one of the few council members who had tried to convince them to stay. She had seen their value when others had been blinded by prejudice and fear. Now she was one of the last survivors of a civilization that had destroyed itself through arrogance. The search for humanity had never truly ended, but it had become increasingly desperate, and futile deep space exploration vessels, when they could be made to function at all, found only empty star systems and the occasional automated beacon broadcasting messages that no one could understand. The messages were always the same simple statements that cut like knives through the hearts of those who heard them. We are thriving. We remember you fondly. The humans had not forgotten their former colleagues, but they had clearly moved on to better things. Some of the messages were more complex, containing what appeared to be scientific data or technological specifications, but the Council's finest scholars could no longer decode them. The knowledge gap between human and alien science had become an unbridgeable chasm. Archaeological teams had discovered evidence of human settlements in distant galaxies, massive engineering projects that dwarfed anything the Council had ever imagined possible. The humans had not just survived their exile. They had built wonders that made their former home look like a primitive village. Construction sites that spanned entire star systems showed evidence of human engineering, but on a scale that seemed impossible. Industrial complexes that could manufacture planets, artificial worlds that were more beautiful than anything nature had ever created. The few images that had been captured by long-range sensors showed cities that floated in space like jewels catching the light of distant stars. Defensive installations that made the Council's greatest fortresses look like children's toys. Transportation networks that moved between galaxies as easily as the old system had moved between worlds. Dr. Park Min-ho had dedicated his life to studying the fragments of human technology that remained, but the more he learned, the more he realized how little the Council had ever understood about human capabilities. The equations he found in abandoned human facilities represented advances in physics that were centuries ahead of anything the aliens had achieved. The humans had been operating on a level of technological sophistication that the Council had never imagined. While pretending to be the junior partners in galactic civilization, they had been like adults playing with children and letting the children think they were in charge. The most painful discovery was the evidence that humans had been trying to teach the aliens for decades. The instruction manuals and educational materials they had left behind were written in simple language that any species should have been able to understand, but the aliens had been too proud to learn from beings they considered primitive. They had dismissed human knowledge as inferior and had refused to study the gifts that had been offered freely. The humans had tried to share their wisdom, but their students had been too arrogant to listen. The final message came through an automated relay system that had been dormant for decades. It was a simple text transmission in perfect galactic standard addressed to whatever remained of the Council leadership. The message was brief, but it carried the weight of 20 years of separation and loss. To our former colleagues in the Galactic Council, we hope this message finds you well. We have established new homes among the stars and built a civilization that welcomes all who seek knowledge, peace, and mutual respect. Our doors remain open to any who wish to learn and contribute. We harbor no anger for past grievances, only sadness for opportunities lost. The galaxy is vast enough for all of us to thrive. We wish you wisdom in your future endeavors with hope for tomorrow. The human collective. The message included coordinates to a distant galaxy where humanity had established their new civilization, but the Council no longer had the technology to build ships capable of intergalactic travel. The very people who could have helped them reach those stars were the ones they had driven away. Engineer Choi Soo-min had been one of the last humans to leave the galaxy, and he had spent his final months carefully dismantling the infrastructure that had made interstellar travel possible. The shipyards that had built the great vessels were now empty. Shells, the navigation computers that had guided ships between stars, were broken beyond repair. The aliens who remained were stranded in their own galaxy, watching their civilization crumble around them while the humans they had rejected built wonders. In distant star systems, the irony was bitter and complete. The Council's final act was to broadcast their own message across the galaxy, a formal apology and admission of their devastating mistake. Chancellor Chun Seok-jin read the words that should have been spoken 20 years earlier. We, the representatives of the Galactic Council, acknowledge our grave error in judgment. We recognize that humanity was not just another member species, but the foundation upon which our civilization was built. Our prejudice and arrogance have doomed us. All we offer this apology, not in the hope of forgiveness, but in the spirit of truth. We were wrong to judge you by our fears rather than your actions. We were wrong to dismiss your contributions while taking credit for your achievements. We were wrong to drive you away when we should have learned from you. We know that this message may never reach you, and that even if it does, you have no reason to trust us again. We do not ask for your help or your pity. We ask only that you remember us as a cautionary tale of what happens when pride blinds wisdom. The galaxy learned too late that diversity was not a weakness to be managed, but a strength to be celebrated. The Council had created a civilization that appeared strong and united, but was actually fragile and dependent on the very people they had chosen to exclude. Somewhere among the distant stars, humanity continued to build and explore and thrive, carrying forward the dreams of what galactic civilization could have been. They had not been destroyed by exile, but transformed by it into something greater than their former colleagues had ever imagined possible. The empty colonies that humans had left behind were slowly being reclaimed by nature. Plants and animals that had been introduced by human settlers were evolving and adapting, creating new ecosystems that were more beautiful than anything the aliens had ever seen. The abandoned cities were becoming monuments to human ingenuity and dreams. Structures that had been built to last for centuries were weathering the passage of time with grace and dignity. The humans had left behind a legacy of beauty and hope. Even as they had taken their knowledge and skills to the stars, the galaxy was quiet now, without the constant hum of human activity that had powered interstellar civilization. The great engines of progress had fallen silent, and the dreams. 10 years had passed since humanity's departure, and Chancellor Chun Seok-jin stood before the emergency assembly of the Galactic Council to deliver the words that no leader had ever expected to speak. The galaxy needed humanity more than humanity had ever needed the galaxy. The assembled delegates from hundreds of worlds sat in stunned silence as the Chancellor read from reports that painted a picture of complete civilizational collapse. The species they had dismissed as primitive and dangerous had been the architects of everything they had taken for granted. The economic collapse was total and irreversible. Trade networks that had operated profitably for millennia were now bankrupt. The currency systems that had facilitated commerce between worlds were worthless paper backed by governments that could no longer function. Merchant Captain Kim Tae-ho watched his cargo ships rust in spaceports that could no longer provide basic services. The automated loading systems that had made interstellar trade efficient were broken beyond repair. The navigation computers that had guided ships safely between stars were showing routes that led to empty space. Manufacturing guilds that had produced goods for billions of consumers were shutting down their factories as equipment failed and skilled workers died from treatable diseases. The production lines that had once turned out perfect products were now producing scrap metal and broken dreams. Quality control systems that had maintained standards for generations were approving products that fell apart within days. The alien workers who operated the machinery followed the same procedures they had always used, but the essential knowledge that made those procedures work was gone. The medical crisis had become a plague that was spreading across the galaxy. Dr. Kang So-young watched helplessly as diseases that had been conquered centuries ago returned with devastating effect. The antibiotics that had saved millions of lives were now useless. against infections that laughed at modern medicine. Hospitals that had once been centers of healing were becoming morgues as doctors struggled with medical knowledge that had been incomplete from the beginning. The human physicians who had developed the treatments everyone relied on had been the only ones who truly understood how biological systems work. Children were dying from diseases that should have been prevented by simple vaccines. Adults were suffering from conditions that had been easily treatable when the humans were still around to explain how the medicines actually worked. The power grid that had supplied clean energy to thousands of worlds was failing in cascading blackouts that left entire planets in darkness. Chief Engineer Go the Jin stared at fusion reactors that were becoming unstable in ways that terrified everyone who understood the potential consequences. The alien engineers who were supposed to maintain the reactors had been following procedures written by humans without understanding the underlying physics. Now that the procedures were failing, they had no idea how to prevent a disaster that could destroy star systems. Environmental control systems that had maintained perfect climates were breaking down in spectacular fashion. Agricultural worlds that had fed billions were experiencing crop failures as automated farming systems turned productive land into barren wasteland. Weather modification networks that had prevented natural disasters for generations were now causing the very storms and earthquakes they were designed to stop. The delicate balance that had kept hundreds of worlds habitable was collapsing as the systems that maintained it fell apart. Transportation networks that had moved people and goods efficiently across the galaxy were grinding to a halt. Spaceports that had handled thousands of ships per day were now struggling to process a few dozen as traffic control systems failed and navigation computers provided directions to nowhere. Communication networks that had connected every corner of the galaxy were experiencing failures that isolated entire star systems. Messages that should have taken minutes to transmit were taking weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. The galactic internet that had made modern civilization possible was becoming a collection of broken links. The military forces that had maintained galactic peace for centuries were effectively grounded. Fleet Commander Bei Haiyan-Wu commanded ships that could barely reach orbit, let alone patrol the star systems they were supposed to protect. Weapon systems that had made Council forces legendary were now more dangerous to their own crews than to any enemy. The targeting computers that had guided missiles with perfect accuracy were now sending them in random directions. The energy shields that had protected ships from hostile fire were failing at the worst possible moments. Defense networks that had protected Council worlds from external threats were offline, leaving the galaxy vulnerable to any hostile force that might want to take advantage of the chaos. Pirates and raiders who had been suppressed for generations were returning to prey on helpless merchant ships. The governmental systems that had administered the galaxy for millennia were breaking down as the computer networks that supported them crashed. Administrative databases that had tracked the activities of billions of citizens were corrupted beyond recovery. The algorithms that had managed galactic bureaucracy for generations were producing random results that made no sense. Tax collection systems were demanding payment from people who had been dead for decades, while ignoring billionaires who owed fortunes to the government. Legal systems that had maintained justice across hundreds of worlds were failing as the databases that stored laws and precedents became unreliable. Courts were making decisions based on incomplete information, while criminals walked free because their records had been lost. Educational systems that had trained generations of alien students were collapsing as the knowledge they had been built on proved to be incomplete. The human teachers who had quietly supplemented alien education with practical wisdom were gone, leaving behind curriculums that prepared students for jobs that no longer existed. Scientific research that had pushed the boundaries of galactic knowledge for centuries was grinding to a halt as researchers discovered that their fundamental understanding of the universe was based on human insights they had never properly credited or understood. The laboratories that had produced breakthrough discoveries were now producing nothing but failure. After failure, the equipment still worked, but the knowledge of how to use it effectively had walked out the door with the humans who had been dismissed as primitive assistants. The council chambers that had once buzzed with the activity of galactic Governance were now filled with the silence of despair. Delegates who had once debated the fine points of interstellar law were now arguing about how to distribute the dwindling supplies of food and medicine. Chancellor Chun Segok-jin looked out at the assembled representatives of hundreds of worlds and saw the faces of people who had finally realized the magnitude of their mistake. They had driven away the very people who had made their civilization possible. The truth was finally undeniable. Humanity had been the invisible foundation that had held everything together. Their unique problem-solving abilities, their talent for innovation, and their willingness to work behind the scenes had made galactic civilization possible, but the humans were gone and they had left no forwarding address. The galaxy was dying, and the only people who could save it were the ones who had been exiled by prejudice and fear. The council had made their choice, and now they would have to face the consequences. The emergency assembly ended with no solutions and no hope. The delegates returned to their dying worlds to watch their civilizations crumble. The galaxy had learned too late that diversity was not a weakness to be managed, but a strength to be celebrated. 2 years had passed since the humans left, and the galaxy was dying. Fleet Commander Bei Hyun-woo stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching his once mighty armada struggle to maintain basic formations. Ships that had been the pride of the galactic military were now barely functional relics held together by hope and prayer. His weapons officer reported that the main cannon was offline again. The targeting system that had made Council ships legendary for their accuracy was showing targets that did not exist, while missing the ones that did. The energy shields that had protected his fleet from enemy fire were flickering like dying light bulbs. Bei Hyun-woo had commanded this fleet for 15 years and had never seen anything like the cascade of failures that now plagued every ship under his command. The sophisticated computers that had once calculated battle strategies with mathematical precision were now giving him advice that would get his crews killed. The truth was becoming impossible to deny, though most council members still refused to admit it. The humans had not just been contributors to galactic civilization. They had been the invisible backbone that held everything together. For generations, human engineers had quietly solved problems that alien experts could not handle. When alien technology reached its limits, humans had found ways to push past those barriers. When systems failed, humans had created elegant solutions that everyone else took for granted. The council had been so focused on what they saw as human flaws that they had never recognized human genius. Research Director and Mi-kyung sat in her office surrounded by stacks of corrupted data files. She had spent months trying to reconstruct the scientific knowledge that had been lost when the humans departed, but it was like trying to rebuild a house with half the blueprints, missing the fundamental research that had supported galactic technology for decades. Was simply gone. The humans had taken their knowledge with them, leaving behind only the finished products without the underlying science that made them work. It was like having a beautiful car, but no understanding of how the engine functioned. Manufacturing had ground to a halt in sectors across the galaxy. The precise techniques that had made galactic industry efficient were disappearing like smoke in the wind. Quality control systems that had maintained high standards for generations were now producing goods that fell apart after a few uses. Production manager Song Ji-ho watched his assembly lines turn out products that looked right but worked wrong. The alien workers followed the same procedures they had always used, but something essential was missing. The human supervisors who had quietly guided production had taken their expertise with them. The medical crisis was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Kang So-young found herself treating diseases that had been conquered generations ago. The medicines that had saved millions of lives were now useless against infections that should have been easy to cure. Hospital after hospital reported the same problem. The treatment protocols in their databases were incomplete or corrupted. The human doctors who had developed those protocols had been the only ones who truly understood how they worked. Now that the humans were gone, the medical knowledge that had supported galactic healthcare was crumbling. Power grids across the galaxy were failing and cascading blackouts that left entire worlds in darkness. The fusion reactors that had provided clean energy for centuries were becoming unstable in ways that terrified the alien engineers who were supposed to maintain them. Chief Engineer Go Dejin stared At reactor readings that made no sense, the control systems were showing normal operation, but the actual power output was dropping steadily. The safety protocols that had prevented disasters for generations were triggering false alarms while ignoring real dangers. The environmental systems that had maintained perfect climates on hundreds of worlds were breaking down in spectacular fashion. Agricultural worlds that had fed billions were experiencing crop failures as automated farming systems. Malfunctioned weather control networks that had prevented natural disasters were now causing the very storms. They were designed to stop transportation networks that had moved people and goods efficiently across the galaxy were collapsing under the weight of their own complexity. Spaceports that had handled thousands of ships per day were now struggling to process a few dozen. The traffic control systems that had prevented accidents were now causing them. Communication networks that had connected every corner of the galaxy were experiencing mysterious failures that isolated entire star systems. Messages that should have taken minutes to transmit were taking days to arrive, if they arrived at all. Video conferences that had made galactic government possible were now exercises in frustration. The Council leadership was in chaos, with different factions blaming each other for the crisis. Some accused rival species of sabotage. Others insisted that the problems were temporary glitches that would resolve themselves with patience and proper management. A few brave council members suggested that the crisis might be connected to the human departure, but they were shouted down by colleagues who refused to admit their mistake. The idea that primitive humans could have been essential to galactic civilization was too humiliating for the proud alien leaders to accept. Trade Director Yoon Hae-won watched the galactic economy collapse in real time. Trade routes that had operated profitably for millennia were now losing money on every transaction. The currency systems that had facilitated commerce between hundreds of worlds were becoming worthless as confidence in the future evaporated. Mining operations that had extracted resources from asteroid belts and planetary surfaces were shutting down as their equipment failed beyond repair. The automated systems that had made resource extraction efficient and profitable were breaking down faster than they could be fixed. The social fabric of galactic civilization was starting to unravel as different species began to blame each other for the crisis. Old rivalries that had been suppressed by Council authority were resurfacing as the mechanisms of galactic government broke down. Military units that had maintained peace for generations were being recalled to defend their homeworlds as the central authority of the Council weakened. The united front that had kept hostile alien races at bay was cracking under the pressure of internal collapse. Educational systems that had trained generations of alien students were failing as the knowledge they had been built on proved to be incomplete or incorrect. The human teachers who had quietly supplemented alien education with practical knowledge were gone, leaving behind curriculums that no longer made sense. Scientific research that had pushed the boundaries of galactic knowledge for centuries was grinding to a halt as researchers discovered that their fundamental understanding of the universe was based on human insights they had never properly credited or understood. The Council had always prided itself on being the pinnacle of galactic civilization, a shining example of what could be achieved when advanced species worked together in harmony, but that harmony had only been possible because humans had been working behind the scenes to solve the problems that threatened to tear the Alliance apart. Now those problems were back with a vengeance, and there were no humans left to fix them. The galaxy was learning the hard way that diversity was not a weakness to be managed, but a strength to be celebrated. The Council had driven away the very people who had made their success possible. The collapse was spreading faster than anyone had predicted, touching every aspect of galactic life. The aliens had thought they were getting rid of a troublesome species, but they had actually amputated the limbs that had allowed their civilization to function. The Council would soon discover that the quiet humans they had dismissed as primitive had been the most advanced problem solvers in the galaxy, and by the time they realized their mistake, it would be far too late to make amends. 5 years had passed since the Great Exodus, and the Galactic Council was finally ready to swallow. Their Pride Ambassador Na Yun-su stood in the Council chambers looking at the faces of alien leaders who had once dismissed humans as primitive. troublemakers. Now, those same leaders were begging her to help them find the humans and bring them back. The galaxy was dying and everyone knew it. Entire sectors were experiencing rolling blackouts that left billions of people in darkness. Food production had collapsed on dozens of worlds, leaving populations on the brink of starvation. The technological marvels that had defined galactic civilization were now monuments to failure. Na Yunsu had been one of the few council members who had argued against driving the humans away. She had seen their value when others had been blinded by prejudice and fear. Now she was leading the first expedition beyond the galactic rim to search for the people who could save them. All the search proved more difficult than anyone had expected. The humans had vanished completely, leaving no trace of where they had gone. The outer rim colonies they had abandoned were empty shells picked clean of anything valuable. The databases that might have contained clues about their destination had been wiped completely. Chief Navigator Lim Haijin plotted course after course into the unknown regions beyond the galaxy, but every lead ended in disappointment. The humans had covered their tracks with methodical precision, leaving behind only questions and empty space. What the search teams did find was evidence of humanity's true contributions to galactic civilization. Hidden in forgotten archives and overlooked reports was the real story of the last 100 years. Humans had been involved in every major breakthrough, every technological advance, every solution to problems that had seemed impossible. Engineer Shin Dong-hyuk made the most disturbing discovery of all while examining the abandoned fusion reactors that had once powered human colonies. The reactors were completely dead, not just shut down but fundamentally altered in ways that made them impossible to restart. The alien engineers who had come to study human technology found themselves looking at machines they could not understand. The control systems were intact, but the core components had been removed or modified beyond recognition. It was as if the humans had performed surgery on their own technology to make it useless to anyone else. Dr. Chun Seok-jin led a team of scientists to examine the medical facilities that humans had left behind. They found empty laboratories and research stations that had once produced breakthrough treatments for diseases that plagued alien species. The equipment was still there, but the knowledge of how to use it was gone. The most frustrating discovery was the encrypted data storage systems that the humans had left behind. Terabytes of information were still present in the computer networks, but protected by codes that would take centuries to break. The humans had made sure that their knowledge would remain out of reach. Archaeological teams searched ancient exploration records, looking for clues about where humans might have gone. They found evidence that humans had been secretly exploring beyond the galactic rim for decades, establishing research stations and colonies in regions that other species had deemed uninhabitable. Captain Park Min-ho had spent his career mapping the unknown regions of space, and he knew that humans had always been more adventurous than other species, while aliens had been content to stay within the safe boundaries of known space. Humans had been pushing into the cosmic wilderness. The search expanded to include deep space monitoring stations that had been abandoned for generations. Ancient sensor arrays were reactivated to scan for signs of human activity, but the signals they detected were too faint and too distant to provide useful information. Some of the search teams reported finding automated beacons broadcasting messages in human languages, but when they tried to decode the transmissions, they found mathematical equations and scientific formulas that made no sense. The humans had developed knowledge that was beyond the understanding of their former colleagues. Dr. and Meek-young spent months trying to decipher the human messages, but the more she learned, the more she realized how little the council had understood about human capabilities. The equations she was seeing represented advances in physics and engineering that were generations ahead of anything the aliens had achieved. The search teams found evidence of massive construction projects in distant star systems. Industrial facilities that dwarfed anything the council had ever built had been established and then abandoned by humans who had moved on to even greater undertakings. Mining operations that had extracted resources from entire asteroid belts showed signs of human engineering, but on a scale that seemed impossible. The humans had not just been good at solving problems. They had been operating on a level of technological sophistication that the aliens had never imagined. Military reconnaissance teams reported finding defensive installations that had been built by humans but then destroyed or dismantled before they left. The weapon systems that remained were so advanced that alien scientists could not even determine what they were supposed to do. The most mysterious discoveries were the artistic monuments that humans had left behind, sculptures and buildings that seemed to serve no practical purpose but demonstrated an understanding of mathematics and physics that challenged everything the aliens thought they knew about the universe. Communication specialist Go. The Jinn spent her time analyzing the few human messages that could be partially decoded. The fragments she could understand spoke of new discoveries and technological breakthroughs that made the Council's greatest achievements look like primitive toys. The humans had not just survived their exile, they had thrived in ways that the Council had never thought possible. They had taken their knowledge and creativity to the far reaches of space and built a civilization that made the Galactic Alliance look like a collection of villages. As the search continued and the evidence mounted, it became clear that the humans had been planning their departure for much longer than anyone had realized. They had been preparing for exile while still participating in galactic society, building the infrastructure they would need to survive and prosper without their former colleagues. The Council had thought they were expelling a troublesome minority, but they had actually driven away the most advanced species in the galaxy. The humans had been quietly operating centuries ahead of everyone else while pretending to be the junior partners in galactic civilization. Ambassador Nayunsu compiled her reports and prepared to return to the Council with the devastating truth: the humans were gone and they were not coming back. The galaxy had lost its most valuable citizens, and there was no way to undo the damage. The search had revealed the scope of human achievement and the magnitude of the Council's mistake, but knowledge of what had been lost was not the same as the ability to replace it. The aliens were like children who had broken a complex machine and could not put it back together. The final insult came when the search teams discovered that the humans had left behind instruction manuals for some of their simpler technologies, but the manuals were written in languages that no alien could read, using concepts that no alien could understand. The humans had tried to leave gifts for their former colleagues, but the gifts were useless to people who lacked the knowledge to use them. It was as if the humans had left behind books written in a language that had not been invented. Yet the search expedition returned to the galactic core with empty hands and heavy hearts. They had found evidence of human greatness, but no sign of human presence. The people who could have saved galactic civilization were gone beyond recall, and the Council would have to face the consequences of their prejudice alone. The galaxy was dying, and the only people who could save it were the ones who had been driven away by fear and ignorance. The Council had made their choice, and now they would have to live with the results. Trade Director Yoon Hae-won sat at her desk looking at numbers that made no sense. 6 months had passed since the humans left, and everything was going wrong. The quarterly reports showed shipping delays across every major trade route. Equipment failures were happening everywhere, and nobody could explain why. She called her assistant over to double-check the data, but the numbers were correct. Cargo ships that had run perfectly for decades were breaking down in deep space mining operations on the Outer Rim were producing half their normal output, and the machines needed constant repairs that cost more money than the mines were making. Yoon Hae-won had been in charge of galactic trade for 20 years. She had seen economic ups and downs before, but nothing like this. It was as if the entire galaxy had suddenly forgotten how to do business. The systems that had worked smoothly for generations were falling apart piece by piece. Down in the medical center, Dr. Kang So-young was having her own problems. Patients were coming in with diseases that should have been easy to treat, but the standard medicines were not working anymore. The treatment protocols were still in the computer databases, but something was wrong with FEMA. Young alien from the mining colonies had come in with a simple infection that any first-year medical student could cure, but when Dr. Kang So-young tried the usual treatment, the infection got worse instead of better. She tried 3 different medicines, and none of them worked. The patient almost died before she found an old-fashioned cure that barely helped. Kang So-young pulled up the medical records and found something strange. The treatment protocols had been updated many times over the years, but all the recent updates had been made by human doctors. The alien doctors had just copied what the humans wrote without Understanding why it worked, she tried to contact the human medical team that had worked on the mining colony protocols, but their communication channels were dead. The humans had taken all their research with them when they left. The aliens were left with instructions they did not understand for. Problems they could not solve in the manufacturing sector. Things were even worse. Production manager Song Jiho watched his assembly lines produce goods that fell apart after a few weeks. The quality control systems were still running, but they were not catching the defects. Machines that had made perfect products for years were now turning out junk. Song Jiho called in his best engineers to figure out what was happening. They took apart the machines and studied every component, but everything looked normal. The problem was not with the hardware, it was with the software that controlled the manufacturing process. The software had been written by human programmers who understood how to make machines work together in harmony. The alien programmers had learned to use the software, but they did not understand the underlying logic. Now that the humans were gone, there was nobody who could fix the problems or update the system's military commander. Bei Hyung-woo had the biggest problems of all. His mighty space fleet was becoming a collection of expensive scrap metal. The weapon systems that had made Council ships feared across the galaxy were malfunctioning in dangerous ways. During a routine training exercise, one of his best ships had fired its main cannon and blown up its own shield generator. Another ship had tried to jump to hyperspace and ended up spinning in circles for 3 hours before the crew could regain control. The navigation systems that had guided ships safely for decades were sending vessels to the wrong star systems. Bei Hyun-woo called an emergency meeting with his technical staff. They brought stacks of manuals and computer printouts trying to explain what was going wrong, but none of them really understood the technology they were supposed to maintain. The truth was becoming clear to anyone who was willing to see it. The humans had not just been another member species in the galactic community. They had been the invisible foundation that held everything together, while the aliens had been taking credit for technological advances. The humans had been doing the actual work. Council Administrator and Mi Kyung discovered the scope of the problem when she tried to access the scientific databases. Thousands of research papers were missing or corrupted. The fundamental knowledge that had supported galactic technology for decades was simply gone. She found evidence that most of the missing research had been written by human scientists. The aliens had used the results of human research to build their civilization, but they had never bothered to learn the underlying science. Now that the humans were gone, the knowledge base that supported everything was crumbling. The power grid that supplied energy to Council worlds was starting to fail. The fusion reactors that had run perfectly for generations were becoming unstable. The alien engineers who were supposed to maintain them did not understand how the reactors really worked. They only knew which buttons to push and which warning lights to worry about. Food production systems were breaking down on agricultural worlds. The automated farming equipment that had fed billions of people was malfunctioning in ways that made no sense. Crops that had grown reliably for decades were failing, and nobody knew where the environmental control systems that maintained perfect climates on hundreds of worlds were going haywire. Some planets were getting too hot while others were getting too cold. The weather modification systems that had prevented natural disasters for generations were causing the very problems they were supposed to prevent. Transportation networks that had moved people and goods efficiently across the galaxy were grinding to a halt. Spaceports that had handled thousands of ships per day were lucky to process a few dozen. The traffic control systems that had prevented accidents and delays were now causing both communication networks that had connected every world in the galaxy were experiencing mysterious failures. Messages that should have taken minutes to transmit were taking hours or days to arrive. Video calls that had been crystal clear were now full of static and interference. The Council leadership called emergency meetings to address the crisis, but they could not agree on what was causing the problem. Some blamed sabotage by enemy species. Others insisted it was just a temporary glitch that would fix itself with time. A few brave souls suggested that the problems might be connected to the human departure, but they were shouted down by the majority. The alien races that made up the Council had always prided themselves on their advanced technology and superior intelligence. They had looked down on humans as primitive newcomers who had nothing to teach the older, more experienced species. Now they were learning that their pride had blinded them to the truth. The humans had not been primitive at all. They had been the most advanced problem solvers in the galaxy, while the aliens had been content to use technology they did not understand. The humans had been constantly improving and maintaining the systems that everyone else took for granted. Research Director Shin Dong-hyuk made a disturbing discovery when he tried to trace the source of the technological failures. He found that human fingerprints were everywhere in the galactic infrastructure, not literally, of course, but evidence of human innovation and problem solving could be found in every major system. The aliens had assumed that their own species had developed the technology that powered their civilization, but the truth was that humans had been quietly solving problems and making improvements for decades. The aliens had been taking credit for human achievements while dismissing humans as inferior. The manufacturing processes that had made galactic industry efficient were based on human innovations. The medical treatments that had saved millions of lives had been developed by human researchers. The communication systems that had connected the galaxy had been designed by human engineers. Even the governmental systems that had kept the council functioning smoothly for generations had been secretly improved by human administrators and programmers. The aliens had never noticed because they had been too busy congratulating themselves on their own superiority. As the crisis deepened and the failures multiplied, a few council members began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. They had driven away the very people who had made their civilization possible, but it was too late now. The humans were gone, and they had taken their knowledge and expertise with them. The galaxy was about to learn a harsh lesson about the value of humility and the danger of prejudice. The aliens had rejected the humans because they were different, but those differences had been exactly what the galaxy needed to thrive. The first cracks in the galactic civilization were spreading, and they would only get worse with time. The council had gotten what they thought they wanted, a galaxy without humans. But they were about to discover that getting what you want is not always the same as getting what you need. Captain Kim Tae-ho stood at the big window of his ship and watched Earth get smaller and smaller in the distance. The blue and green planet that had been home to humans for thousands of years was now just a tiny dot among the stars. His heart felt heavy, but his mind was clear. They had made the right choice. The last human transport ship was leaving the solar system forever. Behind them were empty space stations and abandoned colonies that humans had built with their own hands for 50 years. Humans had tried to be part of the big galactic family. The Galactic Council had promised them friendship and cooperation, but all they got was cold shoulders and closed doors. Ambassador Park Min-ho walked into the bridge room. His face looked tired and sad. He had spent 10 years trying to make peace with alien races, trying to show them that humans were good people who just wanted to belong. But every meeting ended the same way. The aliens would smile and nod and then ignore everything he said. Park Min-ho remembered his last meeting with the council. The big alien leader had looked at him with those strange purple eyes and said humans were too dangerous, too wild to be trusted. The alien spoke in a soft voice, but his words cut like knives. He said humans started too many fights and asked too many questions. They were not ready to be part of civilized society. Kim Tae-ho knew the real truth. The aliens were afraid of humans, but not because humans were violent. They were afraid because humans were too good at solving problems. When other races gave up, humans found new ways to make things work. When machines broke down, humans fixed them. When diseases spread, humans found cures. The aliens did not like being shown up by the new kids on the block. Dr. Lee Yu-jin came to the bridge carrying a small datapad. She was the smartest human scientist alive and had spent her whole life studying alien biology. Her research had saved millions of alien lives, but the council had started giving credit to other species for her discoveries. They said a primitive human could not possibly understand such complex science. Dr. Lee Yu-jin looked at the datapad one last time, then she pressed a button and deleted everything. All her research, all her discoveries, all the medical knowledge that had helped so many alien worlds was gone. She had backed up the important stuff for humans to use, but the aliens would get nothing. They did not deserve her gifts. Down in the engine room, Engineer Choi Sung-min was checking the ship systems one last time. He had built the engines that powered this ship and hundreds of others like it. His designs were used all over the galaxy, but no one knew his name. The aliens thought their own. Engineers had created the technology. They never bothered to read the small print that said "Made by Human Hands Choi." Sung-min smiled as he looked at his beautiful engines. They would run for a few more years, but then they would start to break down. The aliens did not understand how they really worked. They only knew which buttons to push. When the engines finally died, the aliens would not be able to fix them or build new ones. The knowledge would be gone with the humans. The ship was full of families leaving their old lives behind. Children pressed their faces against windows to get one last look at Earth. Parents held each other tight and whispered about the future they were flying toward. Everyone knew they were never coming back. The aliens had made that choice for them. Captain Kim Tae-ho thought about all the humans who had come before them, the first astronauts who had reached for the stars, the colonists who had built homes on distant worlds, the diplomats who had tried so hard to make friends with alien races. All of them had dreamed of a future where humans and aliens worked together as equals, but the aliens did not want equals. They wanted servants and followers. They wanted humans to be grateful for whatever scraps they threw their way. They wanted humans to bow down and say thank you for being allowed to exist in their perfect galaxy. The communication system buzzed with a message from the council. It was the same message they had been sending for weeks, begging humans to reconsider their decision. The council said they were sorry for any misunderstandings. They promised to treat humans better if they would just stay and give them another chance. Kim Tae-ho deleted the message without reading it. All he had heard enough lies and empty promises. The time for talk was over. Humans were leaving and they were not coming back. The aliens would have to learn to live without them. As the ship moved faster toward the edge of the galaxy, Kim Tae-ho remembered all the good times humans had shared with aliens, the trade agreements that had made everyone rich, the scientific discoveries that had pushed knowledge forward, the cultural exchanges that had brought different species together. But he also remembered the bad times, the meetings where humans were ignored, the contracts that were broken for no good reason, the way alien children were taught that humans were dangerous and stupid, the way human achievements were credited to other species. The worst part was how the aliens had convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. They truly believed humans were too primitive to be trusted with advanced technology. They thought they were protecting the galaxy from human violence and chaos. They never saw their own prejudice and fear. Dr. Lee Eugene came back to the bridge with tears in her eyes. She had just finished destroying her laboratory on the mining station they had passed, the lab where she had created medicines that saved alien lives, where she had unlocked the secrets of biological compatibility, where she had proven that humans and aliens could work together. All of that was gone now. The aliens would never know what they had lost. They would never understand that the human woman they had dismissed as primitive had been the key to their medical future. They would learn the truth too late, when their people started dying from diseases that Liu Jin could have cured. Engineer Choi Sung-min joined them on the bridge, his work finally done. He had spent the last month removing all the human modifications from alien equipment. The improvements that had made their machines run better and last longer were gone. The aliens would think everything was still working fine until the day it all broke down. The three humans stood together looking out at the stars ahead of them. They were not angry or bitter. They were just tired of being treated like unwanted guests at a party that they had helped plan. They were ready to find a new home where they could be themselves without apology behind them. Earth grew smaller and smaller until it was just another star in the vast darkness. The human colonies were empty now, their people scattered across the galaxy on ships heading for unknown destinations. The aliens had gotten what they wanted, a galaxy without humans, but they would soon learn that getting what you want is not always the same as getting what you need. The humans were taking with them all the knowledge and skills that had made galactic civilization possible. They were taking the invisible foundation that had held everything together. The aliens would realize their mistake, but it would be too late by then. The humans would be gone beyond the reach of apologies and promises. The galaxy would have to survive without the people who had made it work. Captain Kim Tae-ho looked at his crew and smiled. They were heading toward an uncertain future, but they were heading toward Together the aliens had rejected them, but they had not rejected themselves. They would build something new, something better, something that welcomed all who came in peace. The ship moved on through the darkness carrying its precious cargo of human dreams and human hope. The quiet exit had begun, and there would be no going back.